Good morning, everyone. Welcome to UC San Diego's Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. I'm Joel Dimsdale, and on behalf of the Curriculum Committee, I am absolutely delighted to introduce Professor Igor Grant in psychiatry. Dr. Grant has been a colleague for more than 30 years and is a world-renowned researcher in psychiatry at the interface with medicine. He's also the chair of psychiatry, and he'll be speaking this morning about an extraordinary project concerning Alzheimer caregiving. Igor has led this project with continuous funding from the National Institute on Aging for almost 30 years, and this is just unheard of, but it's a testimony to his leadership skills and scholarship, and I'm looking forward to his talk immensely. Igor.
Well, thank you very much, Joel. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I also heard the tail end of sounds like a slight testimonial for the project. So thank you so very much for your kind words on that. As Dr. Dimsdale mentioned, this is a program of research that's been going on for some years. It was funded first in 1988. And actually, Joel was one of the original co-investigators, continues to be actively involved, and there's a whole group of us that works on this, whom I'll acknowledge at the end. But let me say also that the project, of course, could never happen except for the fact that we've had a wonderful group of volunteers who are the spousal caregivers of persons with dementia. And without their cooperation and willingness to sit with us for hours on end, be probed, poked, give blood, and so forth, obviously nothing would have happened. So I think I don't need to dwell on the fact that caregiving is a stressful experience. And that it's becoming more and more salient given the following facts. There are an increasing number of us, I include me, in this group of graying folks who are hopefully staying healthy. But it's an unfortunate fact that, of course, the dementing disorders, whether it's due to Alzheimer's disease or vascular problems or Parkinson's disease and so forth, are diseases of older people. And so as our population ages, so there is an increase in people developing these disorders. The other important fact is that much of the caregiving for people with dementing disorders occurs in the home. And in our country, it largely falls on the spouse of the dementing person. So about 15 million of us are providing unpaid care to our spouses or other relatives. Most of the caregivers are women. The average age of the person is 52. Now, I said spouses, but in many groups in our population, particularly ethnic minorities, it is actually a daughter that is providing the care. As I'll say, our particular research has focused on the spousal caregiver. And the other important fact is that among those who are providing care, they're providing an extraordinary amount of time devoted to this care. In a national study called the REACH-2 study, it was about 19 hours. And in our study, it's about 17 hours, so very similar. So much of the day is devoted in various ways to providing care. Of course, that depends a lot on how advanced the spouse's condition is. And then in terms of how much time does one spend actually doing things for the person, it's about 8 hours a day. So it's a significant commitment and can be a burden. Now, what kinds of things do caregivers do? I think they're pretty obvious. Managing activities of daily living, including physical things like getting the person out of bed, transferred from a wheelchair, helping them with toileting, bathing, and so forth, feeding. Safety issues. With the dementing disorders, there can be a danger. The person, because of their memory problems or disorientation, will just wander off. And so there are those kinds of concerns. How do you prevent people from falling? Some of the dementing conditions are accompanied by physical instability and coordination difficulties. How do you manage behavioral problems? And these can be some of the most challenging beyond the physical problems. A person who is gradually becoming demented, losing their memory, losing their recognition abilities, word-finding abilities, and so forth, may become behaviorally disordered. And I kind of think of how do we explain or put into context these behavioral conditions in the following ways. First, the behavior may represent loss of function that previously existed. So a person becomes forgetful because they're losing memory. Okay. Or they become disoriented because more and more of their abilities at perceptual motor integration are lost. So that's one aspect of how behaviors occur in dementia. Another has to do with compensatory efforts. So, people may become more and more, for example, obsessive seeming, writing everything down, being very, very particular, and so forth. But this is an effort to compensate for abilities that are being lost. Or a person may try to construct some kind of explanation for what's going on. They can't find their glasses, their car keys, and so forth. And then they start arguing with their spouse and accusing them of putting them away or doing things like this. I hear some giggles, and probably this has happened to you. But you can think of it also, not just that the person is a kind of a son of a bitch, it's more that they don't understand, and this is one way of reconstructing reality that makes sense to them. Of course, also as certain neural circuitries become injured, there can be a loss of, shall we say, higher level control of behavior. So all of us are animals by nature. We have appetites and irritabilities and anger issues and so forth, but we manage to keep those under very good control. As those centers of control become lost, a person may have if you will, a de-refinement of their personality, and so things that were traits before, for example, tending to be suspicious, could become actual paranoia. Things that were kind of tendency to be a little bit irritable or short may become really severe irritability and anger. So these are all ways of understanding, and the only reason I go into this, even though my talk today is not primarily about what can caregivers do, I'm going to talk more about psychobiology of stress in caregiving, but there are, I think, caregivers who understand all of these dynamics and mechanisms of what's going on with the person may find it helpful in addressing things. So let me go on. I think it shows caregiving is stressful. There's a lot to do, and it's both emotionally and physically demanding. Now, as a consequence, we know from a lot of literature that caregivers are at increased risk for developing various kinds of ailments, both psychological and physical. And in particular, there is a higher rate of various kinds of cardiovascular diseases. And that, of course, in part is natural, because cardiovascular disease also tracks with us getting older. But then when you put stress on top of it, you may bring forward in time or increase the likelihood of this stress developing. And so I'm going to be talking a little bit more about our research trying to understand what is the actual connection between stress and these cardiovascular events. So one piece of information that we learned some years ago is as we monitored our caregivers in a longitudinal study, they were more likely to develop high blood pressure. They were not necessarily extremely hypertensive, but they were more likely to move into the mild to moderate hypertensive range. And this is compared to people who were similar in age and social status and gender. So as the research evolved, we developed a kind of framework for understanding caregiving stress, and we've triggered it a triad, a caregiving triad. And this consists of emotional arousal on the one hand, feeling upset, anxious, having negative feelings, and so forth. Sleep disturbance, second part of the triad. And the third is activation of the sympathoadrenal medullary system. What is the sympathoadrenal medullary system? Basically, it's the fight or flight response that you have heard about from probably being in high school even. Stress induces the release of neurotransmitter substances such as norepinephrine and epinephrine, neuropeptide Y, and so forth. And these represent the activation of the sympathetic nervous system and also of the adrenal medulla, which is what produces epinephrine or adrenaline. So our idea has been that this triad of caregiving events triggers physiologic changes, and they include activation of inflammatory factors in the body, a tendency toward moving the balance in your coagulation system toward a more procoagulative response. In other words, kind of blood, if you will, getting a little more sticky. That these are examples of factors that then facilitate cardiovascular injury. So so this is kind of a heuristic or general model of caregiving stress that our study has been working on. You can see at the top here, let me see if I can get this pointer to work. Yeah. So we start with caregiving stressors, which is the demands of caregiving. And then these trigger this triad I'm talking about: negative affect, sleep disturbance, sympathoadrenal medullary arousal, and that can then lead to a cascade of effects that include, as I say, hypercoagulability, inflammatory markers, and then downstream we have cardiovascular injury. So that's the stress triad. Now, what is the evidence supporting this idea? Well, first of all, if we compare caregivers to non-caregiving controls on measures of depressive symptomatology, caregivers, as you would expect, have more negative affect. If we measured anxiety, they would also register higher on that. They have worsened sleep efficiency and other markers of sleep disturbance. Part of that is related to this factor, that they're stressed all the time, but part of it also has to do with actual arousals, that if the dementing person is themselves not sleeping well or getting up and wandering, that obviously disrupts sleep. And then that has these back and forth reciprocal influences between mood and sleep efficiency. And then the sympathoadrenal medullary system, so here circulating norepinephrine in the blood, is higher in high-stressed caregivers. We also have data that I can't show you all the data, but there's data that suggests caregivers are also more prone to have exaggerated responses from this SAM system to stress. So for example, Dr. Dimsdale had a very interesting paradigm where caregivers had to talk about something that could be stressful. And one of the tests was you're at Nordstrom's and you're accused of shoplifting. Okay. And then talk about that. You know, talk to the person who's accusing you of shoplifting. In the meantime, we're measuring your blood pressure and all your blood juices and so forth. And it's very interesting that among caregivers, the spikes in those factors is higher than among non-caregivers. Now, this test produces a stress response in everybody, but it's higher in people who already have the background of chronic stress of caregiving. So these are the kinds of data that we've been working on. But the research right now is focusing even more on the link between this sympathoadrenal medullary arousal and the cardiovascular indicators. And let me come back for a minute. So two of the ones, there are many, by the way, many indicators one could focus on, but we have focused on two areas. One is inflammatory markers, and the other is markers of imbalance in the coagulation system, because both of those are related strongly to development of cardiovascular disease. There are other factors that could be measured. Can't do everything, though. So D-dimer is a molecule that is circulating in the blood normally, and it's one of many markers of the state of hemostasis. That is the balance between the tendency of your blood to clot and the tendency of it not to clot. And you have to have the right balance, because if you had a tendency to clot all the time, you'd clog up. And if you had the other tendency, you'd bleed. So it's a very delicate balance. And D-dimer measures fibrin turnover. So, and what you can see is that in other studies, that the risk for coronary artery disease increases as D-dimer increases. So that's one reason we're interested in this particular factor. Another, and so here you can see, I'm sorry, actually this shows up better than on my screen, but you can see that among our caregivers, this measure of hemostasis is elevated in caregivers versus controls. So, and then there is also, kind of coming back to it, is there a relationship between this sympathoadrenal medullary arousal that I'm talking about, this fight or flight response, and the coagulation marker? And there is. It's not a super powerful relationship, but it exists and suggests that this is one important pathway in how stress moves on to this change in coagulation homeostasis. Another factor that we measure is called interleukin-6. It is one of many, many, many inflammatory markers that can be measured, but it is one that's been researched a lot and where there has been a pretty good relationship established between risk of coronary artery disease and atherosclerosis and elevations in this particular inflammatory factor. And again, we see that among caregivers, this factor is elevated versus non-caregiving controls. So the other thing that is quite important, of course, is the factor of age and other background medical factors. Particularly in our instance, we're looking at people who are more than 55 years old typically. And so we're interested in knowing whether as caregivers get older, do some of these relationships change? In other words, does age in some way mediate or moderate this relationship between stress and these factors? And in fact, that seems to be the case. And the interaction is interesting in that among caregivers, there's a much stronger likelihood that as you get older, your D-dimer will be higher if you're a caregiver than a control. So you can see that by the time people are in their 70s and 80s, there's quite a big difference between caregivers and controls. But in younger caregivers, there's less of a difference. So this may have to do with either more resilience in the younger caregivers, or the fact they're not far enough along in terms of their risk of cardiovascular disease in the first place. But so there is an interaction. And we see the same thing. We see the same thing in IL-6 as well, that the differences between caregivers and controls are accentuated in older caregivers. So we have the factor of stress, we have the factor of sympathoadrenal medullary arousal, and we have the factor of age also operating here. Now, trying to get to kind of a more detailed understanding, again, of the link between stress and cardiovascular indicators, in the next phase of our work, we had focused on several factors. One has to do with a concept called baroreflex sensitivity. Our blood pressure is under exquisite control. It's under control when you think about it. If you stand or sit or lie down, it has to remain kind of the same, because otherwise gravity would pull your blood down and there would be tremendous fluxes. There have to be changes with respect to load, such as if you're exercising or walking versus if you're sitting still, and so forth. And so one question we had was whether this very elegant control of blood pressure may be somehow deranged under conditions of chronic stress. And in fact, there is some suggestion that this is true, that baroreflex sensitivity is lessened among caregivers. Now, the implication of that is that if you have less fine-tuned control, moment-to-moment control of your blood pressure, you could therefore have more spikes in blood pressure. The spikes in blood pressure then can cause shear injury to the inside of blood vessels, because you're pumping, more forcefully than you need to be. And so that's the reason this idea is of interest. Another concept, you don't need to focus on the details of this slide, so one part of the cardiovascular regulatory system we're looking at is the baroreflex, is how blood pressure and heart rate are controlled. But another aspect has to do with endothelial function. Endothelial cells are cells that line the inside of your arteries. And these cells also regulate the diameter of the arteries under certain conditions. And if these cells become damaged, this is how the atherosclerotic process or calcification can begin. So one way to measure the function of these cells, without taking pieces of them out and so on and so forth, is to do a fairly simple thing. You can put on a blood pressure cuff and block the flow of blood to the lower part of your arm. It's a bit painful to begin with, but you kind of get used to it. And then you release the blood pressure, and you see how quickly, effectively, the blood flows back. It's called reactive hyperemia. And under healthy conditions, this occurs very quickly. And under conditions where the endothelial cells are injured, there can be a less quick rebound. So this is what the concept of flow-mediated dilation is. And basically, all this chart shows, if you focus just on, let me see here if I can get this pointer to work. If you just focus on this part of the diagram here, you can see that flow-mediated dilation is less in caregivers than it is in age-matched controls. So there is a little bit of evidence, if you will, that there is some mild injury or dysfunction of these endothelial cells. And it's very interesting, too, that the severity of the dementia of the spouse that is being looked after influences the flow-mediated dilation measures in our caregivers, such that this column 2 that you see, CDR score is clinical dementia rating. So the higher the number, the more demented the spouse is. Remember, we're not measuring the spouse, we're focusing on the caregiver. But the person who is caregiving for the more demented spouse has more of this endothelial dysfunction on the measure that we're looking at. And of course, the idea is the more demented the spouse is, the more stressful it is to look after them. And then similarly, we see that years of caregiving also relate to reductions in flow-mediated dilation among these caregivers. So basically, what this suggests is that the stress of caregiving can influence a number of important physiological factors. One has to do with sympathoadrenal medullary arousal. That in turn can trigger events that change the hemostasis or coagulation path. They can change the inflammatory markers. They can also, the stress can also influence a fine regulation of blood pressure and heart rate, and it can also influence how the lining of these vessels, the endothelium, how healthy it is. Another downstream effect that we're trying to monitor is, well, okay, all of these blood markers and fine measures are interesting, but does it have any actual clinical meaning for caregivers? And so one way to look at that is to say, well, is there actually any evidence that among caregivers there is somewhat more progression in the direction of atherosclerosis? And one way to look at that is to measure what's called intimal media thickness, IMT. And basically what this diagram shows you here is this is just a cross-section of an artery wall. Okay, so it's as though we took a hose and just cut through it, and what you're looking at, here's the outside of it, this part, and here's the inside. So the blood would be here. This would be the lumen. And here, these are muscle cells, and then this is the intima. And so intima media thickness is really measuring part of the diameter of the artery. And as this thickness increases, so there is more likelihood to have hypertension, there's more likelihood that there will be injury to the vessel, and more likelihood that atherosclerosis will develop, and that's why this is being done. And it's measured, I think when I walked in, somebody was saying, oh, they were putting something on my neck or some tube or something, or measuring something. And this is what we are in fact measuring. So the ultrasonography, which involves just running a probe over the neck, allows you to visualize, without obviously opening up somebody's neck, the thickness of these blood vessels and whether there is atherosclerotic disease. So again, this is the blood vessel itself, carotid artery in this case. The intima is here, it's this lining, okay? This, by the way, is where the carotid artery breaks up into two branches, internal and external, as you go up the neck. So you can see a visualization in a real person of this blood vessel. Now, the idea in the formation of atherosclerosis is that there is a gradual pathology that develops such that from either because a person has too many lipids in the first place, they're hyperlipidemic, their cholesterol level is high, and so on and so forth. That can be one factor that may be genetically controlled, but also because of these other factors like, for example, blood pressure regulation is deranged, there's more stress on the inside of the blood vessels and so forth. You get gradually some damage of the vessel, which results in accumulation initially of intracellular fat but eventually, as these particles break down, you get the formation of a plaque, which is like a scar on the inside of the blood vessel. And this scar formation is facilitated by inflammatory factors, because whenever you have something abnormal going on, immune cells start gathering. And so it stands to reason that if we have a condition of stress where the whole inflammatory system is a little bit upregulated anyway, that might advance the process. And secondly, if you have a more procoagulation atmosphere, you're more likely to form clots around this plaque, and then there's a process of inflammatory cells forming these fibrous lesions, and then on and on and on, and then a full plaque is formed. So, and here again is visualizing in a real living person a plaque which is just near the junction of the internal and external carotid artery. Here's the common carotid, so you can see it there. And here you can see also some thickening of the intima media. So these are some of the directions that work is now going in. In other words, to see, is there a real downstream consequence? And then, of course, what can we do about it? Now, something I haven't talked about very much is the positive side. So what are the protective factors that shield caregivers against these kinds of stress-related injuries? And we know not every caregiver becomes sick. Some of them are perfectly healthy, others become sick, others are somewhat in between. So what are the factors? Well, some of the factors are undoubtedly biological. I mean, some of us are just genetically more hardy, more likely to withstand these kinds of stresses. But another concept that's important is resiliency, and in particular, the concept of mastery. Now, the concept of mastery as we use it is an attitude of, I can do this, I can handle this, I see a path to handling it, or let me take this apart and how am I going to fix this problem? As opposed to, for example, this is overwhelming, it's too much, I'm going to collapse in a heap, and you know, I just can't stand it anymore. So I'm painting extremes. But the concept of mastery is the ability to take charge of the situation and the belief that you can do something about it. You can have a positive influence. And so it turns out that I mentioned to you this stressor test that Dr. Dimsdale made our participants do, being accused of shoplifting. And we measure their stress hormones, including norepinephrine. And it's interesting to show that, and you expect a spike in this norepinephrine if you're accused of shoplifting, but that spike was less in people who scored on high mastery versus people who scored on low mastery. So again, the attitude and coping propensity of the person clearly matters in whether or not these stresses translate into physiological consequences. And here's just another bit of data to show the same thing. This is a coagulation marker, and you can see again, after Dr. Dimsdale accused them of shoplifting, the people who were low in their sense of mastery had a higher elevation of the coagulation factor than the people who had low mastery. Shame on you, Dimsdale, putting our subjects through this. Now I'm accusing him, you see, of torture here. How can you take it? Can we measure your blood pressure right now? Okay. All right. So, just wrapping up this part of it then. We think that that there are some important mechanisms and some things we have learned through studies of caregivers as to how cardiovascular disease may become more likely in caregivers. what I've said to you is that caregiving stress induces arousal of the sympatho-adrenal medullary system, the fight or flight system. That in turn is related to imbalance in coagulation factors and inflammatory biomarkers. And that downstream, these changes may be harbingers of clinical cardiovascular disease. And I've shown you some of the evidence. There is a desensitized baroreflex, which means that the fine control, moment-to-moment control of blood pressure is not as good as we would expect. And that could result in spikes in blood pressure, damage to the vascular endothelium. I've shown you from the flow-mediated dilation experiments that there is some subtle injury possibly to this vascular endothelium in caregivers. And I didn't show you the data, but we are finding more and more evidence that the intima media thickness, which is measured by this ultrasonography, is higher among caregivers than controls. So, you want me to stop at 11? Is that right? As far as this part of it? Okay, I think I'm on time. So this is all very nice, but is there anything that we can do to help caregivers avoid this type of chronic physiologic stress? And the answer is that there have been many, many studies attempting to intervene, and the basic concepts are really three in number. One is to provide support. This can be educational, emotional, spiritual, instrumental. Instrumental means practical support for the caregiver. Then there can be therapies based on what I've just said to you about mastery that improve coping or reduce negative affect. Remember the triad I showed you had negative affect, sleep disturbance, and SAM arousal. So if we can intervene on the negative affect, that should have a positive effect. And then, of course, another one is to provide relief from caregiving. This can be temporary, such as having people come into the home or having the demented spouse spend time in a day center or things like that, or long-term if a person is admitted to an assisted care facility. Now, gruesome as it may seem, it turns out that as we followed our caregivers through transition points, and transition points include placement and also the death of the spouse, that in fact these biological measures are improved, once there is a transition to placement, or for that matter, to death of a spouse. So respite does matter, and it's helpful. But obviously it's not the only answer, and it's not the case we're going to put everyone into an assisted care facility, and it may not be practical to get care providers to come into the home. But these are helpful interventions. So I mentioned intervening on the negative affect of this triad. We know that depressive symptoms occur more frequently among caregivers. That's entirely to be understood. Indeed, about 40% of caregivers report significant symptoms of depression, as opposed to about 5%, 5 to 7% of non-caregiving, similarly aged adults. And we do know from other research that depression itself is linked to various changes that make it more likely people will have medical illnesses, including infections, cardiovascular disease, and so forth. So then it stands to reason that if we could intervene on the depressive symptoms easily somehow, that would be one way of perhaps preventing this cascade of cardiovascular events. So, as you might expect, there have been quite a few intervention trials. Among those, the ones that have shown the best promise involve a technique called cognitive behavior therapy. Probably have heard about it. Basically, it's a technique that focuses on the one hand on cognitions. How do you interpret the reality that is before you? Is the glass half full? Is the glass half empty? Can you change it from half full and from half empty into half full, and so forth? Obviously, much more to that, the cognitive side. And then behavioral means getting people to actually act in a different manner in order to support the reframing effort that cognitive behavior therapy involves. As I say, there's good evidence for a positive effect of CBT. None of the studies, to our knowledge, have targeted the physical outcomes we're talking about. They've typically had as an endpoint, do you feel better, or do you behave better, or more positively, but not whether your heart or arteries behave better. And so we have been focusing really on that aspect of it. If we produce an intervention, does it have also biological effects that suggest improvement in the underlying stress biology? And one challenge in all of these interventions is the scalability or practicability of the technique. So for example, if a technique works, but it requires you to see a PhD 30 times for an hour or once a week, that's not a very practical thing, even if it works, because first of all, you can't leave your spouse once a week to spend an hour with your PhD. That would create even more stress in your home and so forth. So it's not some of these things are just not practical, even though they are, even though they work. So a technique that we've been interested in as a consequence is something one of our co-investigators, Brent Mausbach, has both developed and pioneered. It's called behavioral activation. It's kind of a variant of CBT, but focusing much more on the behavior, the B part, than the C. And so his particular program, he's dubbed the Pleasant Events Program. So basically, it's a way of trying to get caregivers to do more things that are good for them and to do them on a regular basis. And believe it or not, it sounds awfully simple, but these techniques do work in ameliorating depression. So our aims in this part of the work right now then are to see if this so-called PEP intervention is more effective than a time equivalent support intervention. That is spending time with people, giving them education, giving them tips, and so on and so forth. And furthermore, to see if these cardiovascular indicators improve. So PEP is a brief intervention. There are variations of it, but typically it's 6 sessions. And some of those are face-to-face. In our case, we go to the person's home to make it easier on them so they don't have to find, somebody to look after their relative and so forth. And other sessions are followed up either in person or by phone calls. And the components are that caregivers are taught to monitor their use of time, particularly time spent on leisure activities, identify activities they would like to engage in, and to develop a hierarchy, that is, what's the activity I want to work on first, and so on and so forth, and then to actually schedule these activities and do them. So here's an example of a kind of checklist that a therapist, or if you will, I prefer to think of it almost like a trainer, would go through trying to select what are things you're interested in. This is not a complete list. The person may say, well, here are some things I want to do, and here's how I would rank them. I'd most rather take a walk, or I'm kind of medium interested in having dinner with a friend, and taking a vacation is not a big item on my list. Somebody else may rank it differently. And then they track their activities over time. Did they actually do this? Did they take a walk? Did they talk with Veronica? Did they play with the dog? Did they make dinner if that's what's pleasing to them, and so forth? And so this just shows people saying yes, no, and so forth. And then over time, you can chart the number of activities, how many weeks you're engaged in them. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this detail. And then at the same time, there's a charting of mood. And so, and that's compared to, as I say, a condition that we call support and information, which is more typical of what people get if they go to various kinds of lay groups, self-help settings, Glenner Center, and so forth, where they would get a lot of information, problem-solving tips, and so on and so forth. So what we're finding in very initial data is that, in fact, as I say, we certainly expect mood to improve, and in fact, in PEP, which is the yellow, you can see that there is improvement. But at 1 year follow-up, people end up in about the same place. Remember, the intervention is brief. It's only 6 weeks. And so one question we're researching now is if we give booster shots by phone, let's say, at 6 months or 12 months, can that keep the negative affect down? Depressive symptoms, as you would expect, also go down. They seem to go down more in the PEP condition. But of really great interest, and I think pretty novel in our research, is to find that some of these biological markers are also improved differentially in this behavioral activation technique. So in this case, the IS is information support, PEP is the behavioral activation program, and so there's a lesson. But as you can see, but at the end of 1 year, if you don't keep doing things, it all comes back to the way it was before. So these things work while they're working. The challenge is, how do you provide these booster shots so that this vaccination, if you will, this behavioral activation vaccination, works for a long time? And D-dimer, we see something similar. So to wrap it up then, I've talked about caregiving stress, some of the elements of caregiving stress, some of the psychobiology of caregiving stress. I've suggested to you that that the stress itself triggers a triad of negative affect, sleep disturbance. I haven't focused on the sleep disturbance side in this talk. Got to quit someplace, but that's another important element. Sympathoadrenal medullary arousal. I've suggested to you how this triad then triggers a set of biological events to include more inflammatory biomarkers, tendency toward hypercoagulability, which then seems to be related to cardiovascular injury. And I've suggested to you what some of the elements of that injury are that have to do in part with blood pressure regulation, in part with endothelial function, and in part with having gradual thickening of these large vessels that is conducive to atherosclerosis in the future. The intervention, behavioral activation, is a brief intervention. We think it has promised to be very practical in the sense that you do not have to have 3 PhDs to master how to teach this. Just a sensible, reasonably educated lay person can be taught how to do this technique. And we think it's a technique that maybe could be scalable in the sense that people could be taught to continue to use it themselves. And so it may be a practical intervention among many things in the stress of caregiving. So I mentioned already that the directions for the future are, how can we use booster shots, potentially, of PEP to keep the effect going? Can we look even more precisely at some of these biological markers of cardiovascular injury? And then if PEP continues to show efficacy in a research setting, can it be scaled up and used in community settings, community groups, and so forth, so that you don't need a bunch of MDs and PhDs to do it. All right, I do want to thank a lot of people. I'm not going to read everybody's name, but as Dr. Dimsdale mentioned, this is a study that's been going on for some years. The first acknowledgement, of course, is to our study participants, these generous caregivers who have given of their time, have allowed us to put blood pressure cuffs on them, probe them, take their blood, and so on and so forth, take their time. Can't do it without them. We've had generous sponsorship from the National Institute on Aging. The main grant is this thing called Alzheimer Caregiver Coping, but Dr. Malspach has also had projects himself, Dr. Dimsdale, Dr. Mills, each of them have had projects that have contributed to this. And then I've listed a series of investigators, and I've probably, Joel, as you look down the list, probably left somebody important out, but there they are. Right. Thank you for your rapt attention to this discourse onto psychobiology of stress in caregiving. I'm ready to answer questions, but I guess we're taking a break first. Is that right? Okay.